June 27, 1967. A Soviet test pad outside Moscow. The largest flying machine ever built begins to rise and immediately starts to shake itself apart. Inside the cockpit, the control column begins to buck violently in the pilot's hands. The machine is fighting itself. One landing gear leg slams into the earth. A tire bursts. A wheel hub bends. For a moment, it looks like the program might end right here. In the West, newspapers reported the giant Soviet helicopter had been destroyed. They were wrong. But the truth was almost as dramatic. This is the story of the Mil-V-12, the largest helicopter ever built. A machine so big it was designed to carry nuclear missiles across Siberia. It could lift more weight than any helicopter before or since. It still holds world records today. But it was also one of the most dangerous machines Soviet engineers ever tamed. Why would the Soviet Union build something this monstrous, and why did it almost tear itself apart before it ever flew properly? The story begins in the late 1950s, at the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was racing to hide its most powerful weapons from American eyes. American spy planes and, soon, satellites could photograph fixed missile silos with terrifying precision. Moscow needed a way to move its ICBMs and hide them. The answer, Soviet planners decided, was a helicopter big enough to carry entire ballistic missile components deep into the forests of Siberia. In 1959, the Mil Design Bureau, already famous for the Mi-6, the world's largest helicopter at the time, began sketching something far bigger. By 1961, the Soviet government made it official: build a helicopter capable of lifting 20 to 25 tons. Nothing like it had ever left the ground. Engineers first tried the obvious layout, a tandem rotor design, like an oversized Chinook. It failed on paper before it ever reached metal. The rotors would have needed to be so large they'd overlap dangerously, or so high off the ground the whole airframe became structurally impossible. So chief designer Mikhail Mil's team made a radical choice: mount two enormous rotors on wingtip pylons, side by side, like a fixed-wing aircraft with propellers. It was called a transverse rotor configuration. Nothing this size had ever used it. The engineering risk was enormous. To save time, Mil's engineers reused proven components, engines, gearboxes, and rotor systems borrowed from the smaller Mi-6 and Mi-10 helicopters. 4 of these engines would power the aircraft, 2 per rotor, connected by driveshafts so that if one failed, the rotor kept turning. Construction of the first prototype began in 1965. Every part of it was oversized, including the risk of getting something catastrophically wrong. When finished, the V-12 was almost incomprehensible in scale. 121 feet long. A rotor span of over 200 feet. Its cargo hold matched the Antonov An-22, big enough to swallow armored vehicles, or the folded stages of an intercontinental ballistic missile. At the nose, engineers built something unheard of: a 2-level cockpit. Pilot and co-pilot below, navigator and radio operator above them. 6 crew members were needed just to fly it. No helicopter before or since has required a flight deck this complex. But it was the rotor system that worried engineers most. 2 massive 5-bladed rotors, spinning in opposite directions, their tips overlapping by nearly 10 feet. Synchronizing 2 rotors this size, on flexible wingtip pylons, was a problem no one had solved before. The margin for error was razor thin. By June 1967, the first prototype was ready for its first hover. The entire program's future rested on the next few minutes. As the rotors spun up and the aircraft lifted off the ground, something went wrong. A resonance began building through the airframe. Vibrations from the cockpit floor were feeding back into the control column every time the pilot input a roll command, amplifying with every cycle. In seconds, the oscillation grew violent enough that the pilot had no choice but to put the aircraft back down, hard. A tire burst. A wheel hub bent under the impact. The crew climbed out shaken, but alive, and the aircraft largely intact. Engineers traced the cause to a harmonic flaw, the airframe's natural vibration frequency matching the control system's own resonance. A design flaw hiding in plain sight. For over a year, engineers rebuilt the control linkages, stiffened structures, and refined the autopilot to break the deadly feedback loop. On July 10, 1968, test pilot Boris Galitsky took the rebuilt V-12 into the air again. This time, for 15 tense minutes, it held together. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't gentle. But for the first time, the largest helicopter in history was flying under control. The setbacks weren't over. In 1969, the first prototype suffered a serious accident during testing, caused by an engine failure. Once again, the crew survived. Every crash, every hard landing, fed back into the design. Slowly, painfully, the VE-12 was being tamed. By February 1969, the aircraft that had once shaken itself off the ground was setting world records instead. It lifted over 31 tons to a height of nearly 10,000 feet, a payload record for rotorcraft that had never been touched. 6 months later, it broke its own record, hauling over 40 tons into the air. To this day, that record has never been beaten. Test pilot Vasily Kolochenko was at the controls for the record flight, flying a machine that had once nearly killed its own crew, now flying flawlessly. In May 1971, the V-12 left Soviet airspace for the first time, flying across Europe to the Paris Air Show at Le Bourget. For NATO observers watching from the ground, it was a stunning, unsettling sight, a Soviet flying machine bigger than anything the West had imagined. It hovered. It performed slow passes. Cameras from a dozen countries captured the same machine that had almost destroyed itself for years earlier. But even as the VE-12 impressed the world, the mission that created it was already disappearing. American reconnaissance satellites could now photograph Soviet territory from orbit, far beyond the reach of any spy plane the VE-12 was meant to evade. And Soviet missiles themselves were shrinking, becoming mobile enough to move on ordinary trucks. The giant helicopter's original purpose had quietly vanished. A second prototype finally flew in March 1973, 5 years after the first. But by then, momentum had already stalled. In 1974, after nearly 15 years of design work, the entire program was quietly shut down. Only 2 aircraft had ever been built. Soviet planners eventually solved the heavy lift problem a different way, with a conventional single-rotor design that became the Mi-26. The V-12's transverse rotor experiment, born from Cold War necessity, would never be repeated at this scale by anyone, anywhere. And yet, despite its short life, the VE-12 proved something remarkable, that engineers could take a machine on the edge of catastrophic failure and, through relentless iteration, make it fly straight. Today, both prototypes still exist. One sits at the Mil factory near Moscow. The other stands preserved at the Central Air Force Museum at Monino. More than half a century later, it remains the largest helicopter ever built, a record no nation has attempted to break. It was never destroyed by its instability. It was defeated by something far more ordinary, changing technology, and a mission that no longer existed. The helicopter that once shook itself apart on a Moscow test pad ultimately flew clean across Europe and into the history books. The Mil VE-12 was never meant to be safe. It was meant to be possible. And against every early sign that it shouldn't fly, it did. It stands today not as a warning, but as a monument to how far engineers will go to solve a problem the world said was